Hello, and welcome to the Critical Path Institute podcast. Our goal for this podcast is to connect the dots among our core competencies in regulatory science, biomarkers, data management and standards, clinical outcome assessments, and modeling and analytics, and how we accelerate drug development. CPath created this podcast for researchers, clinicians, and industry and regulatory professionals with the hope that these conversations and the resources we share will advance your efforts and partnerships to improve global health.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of the eCOA Conversations series brought to you by the Critical Path Institute's eCOA Consortium. My name is Scottie Kern and I have the privilege of leading this panel discussion today that will explore the use of eCOA and clinical outcome assessments, COAs more broadly, in oncology research. As ever, we have tapped the deep expertise from among the eCOA Consortium's membership to present a range of perspectives, and our panel today includes Bill Byrom, the Principal of eCOA Science at Signant Health, Melissa Mooney, the Director of eCOA Solution Engineering at IQVIA, and Thomas Moll, Senior Scientific Advisor at Clario. But for today's discussion, we are also blessed to have the academic perspectives of Devin Pipert, Professor of Health Outcomes Research and 125th Anniversary Chair at the University of Birmingham. And we start our discussion with Devin, who I asked to share his perspectives on where we are as an industry in terms of understanding the importance of having a clear COA strategy for oncology clinical research.
I think we're recognizing it more now than we ever have in the past. I would say we're doing well in terms of learning from, in oncology specifically, now decades of research, pointing to the need for a strategy versus maybe a cursory approach. We know that QOL, patient-reported outcome measures, have been in cancer trials since the 90s, and some of that has been great and transformative, and some of it we've really learned a lot from about how to improve our approaches. And so emphasis on the strategy, I think we've learned a lot from a number of major research enterprises, international consensus, et cetera, on how to do that better, particularly with PROs. Now, I'm present to the fact that we're talking about COAs more broadly today, and I would be curious to expand our thinking in oncology specifically beyond PROs, not leaving PROs behind, of course. They are important. Maybe they're the most important COA in some respects, but we know that performance measures have a major role to play. We know that observer reports have a major role to play, among others.
Yeah, I agree with you, Devin. And I think what you were saying at the beginning, I think perhaps oncology has lagged behind other therapy areas, actually, in terms of good measurement strategy. And, there's probably some reasons for that. And I think one of the reasons is that we see a lot of different trial designs, like single-arm trials and open-label trials in oncology. And those are particularly difficult to interpret with a subjective endpoint like a PRO. And I guess some of the regulators worry about, the bias that, you might be unavoidable when you've got those types of study designs. But I think we have actually started to see a bit of a groundswell and a bit of a change in terms of perhaps our positioning around this, with a growing realization that this data is really important. It's really important to the patient and the physician in terms of their shared decision making. So it's really important to get on the labeling, for example. And we've seen very few examples, perhaps up until recently, at least in the FDA, of PRO data on labeling. And possibly some of that's because of the study designs. But I think other aspects of that is because of some of the specificity of the endpoints. I know we're going to come on to the regulatory position in a little while. But it's been nice to see some recent examples actually from FDA of labeling on of PRO-based endpoints on labeling, and some very recent examples of that. And I think that's a really significant thing. And I think that's started to show that we're actually seeing this recognition of growing importance of COAs in oncology development.
No, maybe just one thought. I think Bill is right that we might have been a little bit behind because everyone just assumed that it's okay to do imaging and see your tumor shrink or not. But now I think we're basically the only big TA that has an FDA guidance specifically on PROs. So it's a very privileged position actually now to make sure that the importance of, in this case, patient-reported outcomes is recognized more broadly. It's still a bit of an uphill battle, but I think we're making great progress.
Okay, so Bill, you kind of nudged towards the kind of regulatory perspective there. We've referenced what FDA have done, and Thomas, you've helpfully sort of underlined that there's a uniqueness about recommendations there. But can we get a broader sense of what the regulatory perspective is in terms of COAs in oncology research?
I think there's been a recognition that kind of the way that we've done it up until fairly recently in terms of measurement strategy for PROs in oncology is pretty flawed. We're with the chemotherapy, the cycle-based treatments, we tended to be waiting for patients to come into the clinic, and when they're ready to take the next cycle of treatment, we'd give them a health, the quality of life questionnaires or whatever at that time point. And that's the time point at which they're feeling well enough to take the next lot of treatment, right? So we've already introduced some bias into that. We're not really understanding what it was like for them over the course of that cycle. We're just looking at them at the point at which they feel recovered enough to take the next drug. And so it's not the right way to do it. And so I think one of the things that FDA has done really helpfully is identify that and say, look, the timing of the assessments are really important, and we want to see you doing more frequent assessments of various endpoints and measures across the treatment period, not just at the end of cycles. And in particular, they talk about 5 specific domains that they really want to be looking at independently. So rather than the broad measure of a quality of life, they want to look at sort of 5 specific things. They've got disease-related symptoms, they've got symptomatic adverse events, they've got their overall side effect impact measure, and they've got physical function and role function, and those 2 being more about the impact of tolerability. And so I think this is a really great step forward. It's really good work from the FDA, and it's really good guidance. It makes a lot of sense in terms of measurement strategy, but it turns on its head the way we're going to do things, because we're not going to be just simply measuring things when the patient comes to clinic. We need to measure things on a regular basis when the patient's at home. And that means we're going to be using more electronic patient-reported outcomes to enable us to capture that rather than simple paper-based questionnaires.
I totally agree with Bill on this one. And I think, lots of regulators internationally are doing a good deal of focus, so we do see MHRA here in the UK focusing down. And I know personally, just having lovely conversations with them. EMA, I know, is focusing, has had a great, I didn't participate in it, but had a great, recent conference with the ERRTC where they brought together lots of thinkers on how to advance this. So seeing that international sort of reach, I think, is going to be really important to extending on some of what maybe FDA was first to codify in some ways. And one of the things I'd like to remark on where I think it's gone quite well from the FDA, which I would say, across the institution of the FDA, there's a lot of guidance there now too. So we're talking about the OCE's or the Oncology Center of Excellence's core PRO or PRO core set, but there's also the patient-focused drug development guidance series, which I think complements that very well, and it is quite specific and useful in some ways. But all of that has catalyzed kind of a new focus on regulatory science in some ways, so that people outside of the regulatory sphere are responding to guidance, responding to the interests of regulators, and then doing further science to help advance. The regulators' willingness to engage has been fantastic for the scientific activity and community in support of drug development as well, both in the academic space where I am, but also bridging to collaborators in industry. And I think that's one of my favorite parts about this job is I get to sit on calls like the one I'm on today with people from different parts of this ecosystem and really sort of work towards a common goal.
It always surprises me as someone working for an eCOA vendor when we're implementing eCOA solutions, we really don't see a lot of monitoring of symptoms or treatment side effects. So I am really looking forward to seeing in the future, how COA strategies are going to evolve to start, to Bill's point, to start looking at those things earlier and more frequently. So I think we're really going to see the regulatory guidance shape COA strategies, and that's going to have a huge impact on how we're implementing the technology to adhere to those, ever evolving strategies.
Melissa, I think that's super important. And, oncology is unique, isn't it, in a sense? I think it's the only therapy area that I know that we use phase 1 in patients. And so it does give us that unique opportunity to collect patient-reported outcomes even as early as phase 1 and for them to be actually relevant. And, I think that early phase stuff is so important. There's so much literature out there about, the clinician report. So we get clinician reported tolerability, like the CTCAE data, for example. Clinicians systematically underreport the frequency of events using that tool, and they underscore the adverse events. So what a patient might consider as severe, they might be rating as moderate or mild. And that becomes super important when we think about using that data to understand and characterize the tolerability profile of the drug, and then use that to select an optimal dose to then take forward. And, I think we've kind of seen in the past, we've got about 25% of kinase inhibitors, when they were approved by the FDA. So going back a little while, so 2000 to 2015, about 25% of those were approved with post-marketing commitments to study alternative doses. And part of the reason for that is probably this problem that we're not, without the patient data, that's part of the problem, without the patient data, we're not seeing the true tolerability profile of the drugs, even in that early phase where it's so important. I think we're going to see more of this, but I still feel sponsors are perhaps a little cautious in terms of knowing how to bring COAs and PROs into early phase in an optimal way, in the correct way.
I can reflect that what myself and others from multiple institutions co-led an international consensus work group on use of PROs in early phase trials. A lot of the focus was on oncology because that's where a lot of therapeutics are. And it was great because we had regulators from all across the world. We had people from industry. We had relatively few people from academia. It was more about, the sort of implementers and users of tools and sort of how they thought about the feasibility of actually bringing PROs into that early phase context. And we got, even in phase 1, a good feedback around the potential to do so. I'm curious to see how that will pan out in terms of, will sponsors come forward and really recognize this as part of that early phase value element when there's other pressures to sort of get to phase 2 and all that stuff. But I can't imagine anything being more important to the eCOA and the ability of eCOA to pick up, on a quite frequent basis over time and almost in real time, adverse events as reported by the patient when they emerge, to figure out how to sort of identify appropriate doses, MTD, et cetera.
One of the things that brings, Devin, is there's a challenge because quite often in those very early studies, we know very little about the drug. And so when we use something like a pro-CTCAE in phase 3, we already know quite a bit about the tolerability profile, and we can select the 10 or 12 adverse events that we really want to study in that patient group in those studies. But when it comes to early phase, we might know a little bit about the class effects. We might know something about the drug in terms of its effect in animals or whatever, but we don't really know how it's going to respond and behave in humans and patients. And so it gives us a challenge, doesn't it, in terms of how do we design a questionnaire, or how do we design an ePro solution to be able to have that sort of adaptability or that flexibility to be able to change as you're going along, to collect different adverse events as you learn more about the drug, maybe to start with a long list and to be able to present that to patients in a way that's convenient and not burdensome to work through. And those are kind of questions we need to think about in terms of how we do that, because to be successful, we need to have answers to those questions, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to a point that Bill raised a couple of minutes ago, just to drive that home, and it's almost a bit of a pity that it isn't in the guidance. But as he mentioned, we have evidence that investigators or even treating physicians don't have the same appreciation of adverse symptom severity and maybe even frequency. And I think the first publications on that matter are like 10 years old, 15 years old. So I think that really underscores the importance of giving the participants or patients the possibility to report out for themselves. And just want to make sure that we mention that the entire PROTECT study program really highlights that very, very convincingly, that there is actually a clinical value in having your patients involved in the collection of their own adverse symptoms or of their own endpoints, if we speak in clinical trial language. So I think this is probably something where we've had two tracks that moved along in parallel, and hopefully in the near future we'll see some more connection between the world of clinical practice guidance and regulatory guidance, especially given the particularities of oncology as a therapeutic area that have already been mentioned.
At the end of the day, eCOA itself is really only going to be as successful as the COA strategy that it's built on. So, it's easy to blame technology when, maybe compliance isn't so great in a study, quality of the data. But again, going back to all of these points, if we're taking the time up front to develop smart COA strategies that adhere to what the regulators are looking for, we're going to be asking patients things that are relevant to them. We're going to be asking those questions at the right time point. And I think that is really what is going to help drive the success of eCOA. Your COA solution is only going to be as simple and solid as the strategy that it's built on. I really do think we've seen a really positive impact on the regulatory guidance, increasing the utilization of COAs in oncology research. Mainly, it's traditional clinical trials, phase 2, phase 3. To some degree, there's a level of predictability when we see these protocols come our way. Not to say that there aren't challenges and nuances in these types of trial designs, but we kind of can predict that we're looking at about 3 to 5 validated questionnaires, general health measures and cancer-specific questionnaires, until all of the points made earlier, that the cadence of capturing that data, it really does still very much coincide with clinic visits. We don't see a whole lot of, capturing data remotely or away from the site, though I do think the guidance has introduced a little bit more flexibility. We're starting to see in COA strategies that it is acceptable to capture a questionnaire maybe a day or two before a clinic visit. And that really helps alleviate some patient burden, giving the patient the opportunity to answer questionnaires from, the comfort of their own home, as opposed to on site when they're about to receive a treatment. They're likely distracted when they're on site getting ready to, undergo their treatment cycle. So we're starting to see a little bit more flexibility with, leveraging BYOD technology so that we can accommodate capturing patient-reported outcomes, from home prior to a visit.
I would say perhaps we should also think about the value of the data to health technology assessments as well. So beyond the regulatory acceptance, PRO data can become a really important component of that sort of pricing evaluation piece, and providing that patient experience data to support that, those discussions and those negotiations can become really important. And we need to collect that, obviously, during our clinical trials program. So I guess not just focusing just on the regulatory endpoint, but on that as well, I think is important and broadens the net then to why we need to do this in our phase 2 and 3 studies.
And it might well be a differentiator for a sponsor if they are in a very busy indication, like, I don't know, lung cancer, for example, or breast cancer, showing that you have the better PRO data.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a nice point, Tom.
I'm curious to hear from the folks here, maybe especially Mel, about So one of the roles I have is as a volunteer role in the U.S. is a eCOA GACRINS, and that's one of the community cancer trials groups of the PRO work group chair there, where we look at embedding PROs and many cancer protocols coming across, and it's a bit of a different setting than the pharmaceutical type trial, and because you're fundamentally working with cancer or outside of academic centers. Oftentimes, you're working in the community setting where, even we have a nice eCOA solution that's been sort of generated, but it's almost a standard now for us that even when that's used, there also must be paper available, and we have to use a multimode approach. And I think some of the things we're talking about today to really capture the value of not just the eCOA. I see eCOA as a tool to do what we want to do scientifically and regulatory wise. How do we surmount the challenges around digital inclusivity to outside of the places that are really good at research and that really have all the tools, and that you're talking about the pressures and burdens on a clinical research coordinator who, this is one of a million things they have to do to implement a protocol. And so in some ways it seems like eCOA could solve a lot of their problems, but yet we see it's actually hard to adopt in some ways. And so I think being able to unlock that it is going to release many of the benefits we've chatted about here.
Yeah, no, those are excellent, really good points there too, Devin. You're right. And I probably to some degree have blinders on because where I sit, we primarily are building eCOA for, clinical trials, big pharma. So I do think there is still a lot of other areas of oncology research, like real world, for example, where we probably aren't leveraging eCOA. And paper is still on the table. And a lot of that comes down to cost too. eCOA, to be honest, you had to have a budget to be able to support it. So I do think we need to be more mindful of how we can support different areas of research so that they have access to technology solutions that are going to, help collect better outcome data. And you're right, it can be, a challenge when we have, various patient populations. I know in oncology, you can have older patients. And a lot of times we're faced with the elderly going to be able to manage the technology. And I think a lot of concerns around, including all patient populations and ensuring they can use technology, we focus on training. eCOA training is key. And there's plenty of literature that supports that even, amongst elderly patients, as long as there's the appropriate eCOA training, we're helping patients get comfortable with using technology and navigating it, they can be very successful.
I think that's spot on, Mel. And you talked about BYOD, and I think BYOD is a good solution for oncology trials, particularly if we're doing the frequent at-home collection, because there's periods of time where people are going to feel quite sick, and asking them to do something on another phone that they've had to keep charged somewhere else in the house, versus, they've spent the day in bed, but they've got their own phone, and they're perhaps making the odd social media communication with their friends or whatever. That's the place to record the data. So BYOD becomes important, but there is then a digital inclusivity question around that, Devin, as you brought up. And I think, in pharma clinical trials, we very rarely would recruit people who only got a certain type of smartphone to enter the study. Like, we would always have provision devices available for patients who didn't have ones that they could use themselves. But yeah, I think there's still more we can do there in terms of thinking that through, and certainly when you then extrapolate that into routine care and how these tools might be useful there, the digital inclusivity is a huge question, isn't it? I completely agree.
On the subject of training, and I can't remember in which one exactly it is, but I mean it is also worded as a requirement or a strong recommendation by the FDA. I don't know whether that was in one of the PFFD documents, but just on the point of the elderly, I mean, probably every one of us has heard it as a concern coming from clinical trial sponsors. I don't think that there's really good data that proves that, because you could consider for how long even someone who is considered elderly now has been exposed already to touchscreen devices of any sort. You could consider also that we do have some data, at least on compliance, that we can look at. I mean, the one thing that we can't really do very easily is have a combination of device level metadata, including compliance, and the patient characteristics, because these are obviously owned by the sponsors. If we could do that at a very large scale, I'm pretty confident that we could show that there's very little relation between age cohorts and compliance, if we accept that compliance is a good surrogate for understanding and being able to provide data electronically.
I think to Mel's point, the secret is in the training. If you're working with elderly patients and perhaps who are less technology literate, they learn how to use an app in a different way that you and I would. And I think it's highly unlikely my mum will listen to this podcast, so I could probably use her as an example. She will be afraid, and many older people who are less technology savvy or confident will be afraid of breaking something by experimenting with it. So, for example, you and I would learn an app by just opening it up and tapping around and figuring out what it does. Whereas an older person might be afraid of breaking it or doing something wrong. And so that level of anxiety around the use of that technology is important to overcome. And the way to overcome it is through the training, as Mel said. And quite often you might want to run through a training session more than once with an elderly person so that they've actually really got the hang of it by the time they leave the doctor's office. And in that case, they become highly compliant in terms of their measurement capabilities.
There's one thing related to that increasing, let's say, modularity of the entire trial design approaches in oncology, so that you have combined, well, I already have combined phase 1, phase 2, where your phase 2 patients, if the drug is promising, might remain on the drug for a high number of cycles, and therefore 1, 2, 3, 4 years, hopefully. So that is data that is obviously very important to collect, but you might not have planned for it in the beginning. It's as true probably in phase 2 and phase 3, except that the cohorts are even bigger, so it becomes also a cost implication. So I guess in an ideal world, you would maybe like to start with provision devices and then have an option to switch to BYOD after 1 or 2 years in order to allow a very, very long-term collection. But obviously that comes with a lot of logistical and design challenges. So it's that modularity aspect, I think, which poses some unique challenges in oncology.
I think there are some kind of treatment side effects that do affect patients' ability to collect data at the time intervals that we want them to collect it at. So, if we think about things like, fatigue, brain fog, other side effects that they may well be experiencing, some patients will talk about, days 3 to 5 in their cycles as being their really tough days, and they're the days that they spend most of the time in bed or whatever. Well, if we developed a measurement strategy where we're asking them on day 4 to always record their PROs, right, that's going to be a problem. And so I think there are things we can do to think about how best to collect good data, but provide patients the flexibility around collecting it. So, maybe extending the collection windows instead of it just being on a single day, we have it over a 3-day interval or something, so that, they can find a day when they're able to do it. They feel able to do it. It would just be a good time. Thomas, you mentioned the PROTECT study a little while ago, and I think that's a really interesting example, because that was a study that was published recently. It was in about 1,200 patients, and they basically were all on routine care, but half of them used an ePro and half of them didn't. And what they found with the ePro patients was they had fewer emergency room visits, and they had longer time to deterioration in physical function, and they had better symptom control. And the reason for that was not because they were using this mysterious ePro solution, but because the clinic staff were referring to the data they were entering and putting in place interventions quickly and in a timely manner. And that feedback cycle meant they were getting that better symptom control and hence all the other benefits. And their completion rate was over 90%. It was about 92% or something. And that was over a year of weekly completion. Now, we don't see that in clinical trials, right? That would be a marvelous outcome for a clinical trial. We don't tend to see completion rates that high. And the reason for that is we need to learn from that example, for the patients to be willing to collect this data and keep collecting it on a regular basis, even when they're feeling unwell. I believe they will do it if they see that it's being valuable to their treatment and they're getting real benefit from it. So, if our investigators and the nurse and the study nurses are looking at the data every week, and they're then phoning up the patient, hey, I see you've reported mouth ulcers. Well, listen, we'll send you a prescription for such and such, and start using that. That should control that symptom quickly. And by the way, you can expect it just for a few weeks. It should die down after that. And that sort of level of kind of feedback loop, why can't we use that? Why don't we use that in our clinical trials? I don't think we see that at this point. I think that the PRO data goes into a little bit of a black hole. I don't believe the sites really look at it in detail. And yet, if we could learn from that study that you mentioned, Thomas, I think that's the secret here in terms of, patients being willing and wanting to report this data because they see immediate value from it.
And if I could just add to that, because I think that's an important point when we think about some of the challenges in oncology research. So, clearly we've talked about how we want to make sure the technology isn't adding additional burden to the patient, and, BYOD is helping with that, and, the right schedule of assessments and things of that nature. But I do agree. Another key aspect of a successful eCOA solution is not only collecting the data, with quality and with high compliance, but making sure that as vendors, we understand, what this clinical site, what the study team needs to be able to access in terms of the eCOA data. So having the right dashboards and reports, and maybe even email alerts that can notify a site when we notice noncompliance, or maybe if a particular symptom was reported, that really helps facilitate that feedback loop that you mentioned, Bill. And just staying engaged helps the site stay engaged with the patient, and that's going to have a positive impact on the patient experience.
If I can just be a third to pick up on this, this is something we've known for a long time in PRO science, and it's recently been emphasized in systematic investigations of how patients perceive the burden of filling out PROs. We hear a lot about this. Oh, we can't burden the patient too much. It can't be 7 questions. It must be 5. I think we got to be real. Of all the things that patients are asked to do in trials, filling out PROs is not the burdensome part. And you hear that from patients. And what we know from patients is that a few extra PRO questions, if it's going to do something for them, is not burdensome at all. In fact, it might be perceived as an opportunity to report on the things that they care about and want addressed. So having a PRO assessment that's 20 questions instead of 10, it isn't the game changer. The game changer is being able to leverage the data to do something important to the patient with it. I started my career in some ways in chronic kidney disease, and in the U.S., we had a PRO instrument as part of routine care as mandated by CMS in all dialysis clinics. But that wasn't actioned at all. And patients became resentful of it. Clinicians became resentful of it. And so we've known since then. I mean, and patients coming on that would say, that goes again back to the early 2000s, 90s, patients would say, well, it's a bit like someone asking how you are, but then, they don't really care that much, and I think it's, if we take that model and say, look, it's not about asking people to fill out PRO questions on a certain number of days with a certain number of questions and all these things. It's about really sort of how useful it is to them and getting something for them in addition to just the data for the trial. I think we're going to see a lot of uptake and address some of the issues that we've been talking about.
And I'm glad you referenced that paper, actually, Devin. I know you published in the British Medical Journal Oncology recently about that overly paternalistic attitude that might be getting in the way of very valuable, very important data. So glad you referenced that. And in fact, I'll stay with you, Devin, just to take us to the last discussion topic of what does the future look like? Thinking again specifically about electronic mechanisms to capture the patient voice going through oncology treatment. What do you see as the future?
Yeah, so I see, I'm going to return to some themes that we've mentioned throughout already and emphasize them more. So I've been spending a good amount of time on advanced therapies like cell and gene therapies. I've been spending a lot of time on rare diseases within cancer and outside. These are cases where I think we're not ever going to get what we need completely out of the trial in terms of the final regulatory story, approvals, and story about the data. So we go back to Bill mentioned TKIs early on with a commitment for long-term follow-up to fully understand tolerability over time. I think for really rare diseases, for advanced therapies, we're looking at the need to do long-term follow-up in the real-world setting through PROs or other types of COAs, and we need to figure out how to do that in a way that integrates with the care that patients receive on a routine basis. It needs a specific look at what are the different systems require across and finding solutions that work across versus sort of, and it's very easy to get caught up in your own narrow silo, right? You just want to solve the problem that you have. You don't want to boil the ocean, but we might want to boil the swimming pool in some ways, if we can use that as an analogy.
I'd like us to be able to solve two challenges. One we already talked about actually, and Melissa mentioned that at a minimum we need to have email notifications in place to tell sites about observations within the PRO data or things within the PRO data that correspond to certain signals that have been predefined. So that's fine, but since we have that data basically analyzable in real time, there are layers of complexity that we can potentially add. Then the issue is probably if we do it now, let's say in neuro studies where it's well accepted because very often a PRO is going to define the primary endpoint, then a sponsor team, which is very specialized, is going to look at the outcomes of these real-time data analysis. In oncology, I feel we can't throw that at the site team because they are already stretched very thin with respect to everything they have to do. So maybe we'll find a super smart solution in the future, which helps us to leverage that effect that was observed in PROTECT and which Bill described also in clinical studies. The other point is, and this is one where I'm even less convinced that we're going to solve it immediately, but given the nature of the therapeutic area and the big proportion of small biotechs active in early studies, well, these very often live funding round to funding round. So getting over that hurdle to convince them that the cost that they see for including PROs, even though we try to convince them that it's ultimately less than the cost of paper, it's still a cost which they're very often not willing to spend because they feel they don't have the money. So we're still stuck in a conversation, about these three corners of a triangle: cost, quality, speed. And they say, well, we want speed, we want cost, we don't necessarily want the highest quality. So that can be a little bit frustrating, and I think we need to do better collectively as an industry, convincing people that they can have the three corners of the triangle because cost isn't really an obstacle to collect good PROs.
So I might just pick up on something that Devin said about rare diseases. I think we do see a lot of rare disease in cancers, rare cancers. And I think we're starting to see increased use of item banks and the like to enable us to measure pertinent and domains and concepts of interest in these patients with perhaps different sets of symptoms and different things that we need to look at in these patients. And I think for me, that's great, and we will see probably increased usage of that. But I think there are some methodology questions that need to be answered to kind of accelerate and help us to do that. And one of the things that's kind of most on my mind is how you present the data and how you present a kind of a coherent picture around when you use additional items in addition to perhaps a well-defined scale with well-defined subscales. So if we look at EORTC as an example, we've perhaps got various subscales and various symptom scales within there. And we might add some additional items because they're important, but they might actually map to some of those existing subscales or symptom scales in the instrument. And the way that we're reporting that at the moment is we report that instrument subscale score, and then we'll report the individual item scores for the other items that we've added into that, added on top of the instrument. And from a patient and a clinician perspective, this is kind of a disjointed thing. There's no coherence in our ability to explain those results. So, and yet we know the psychometrics of the instrument. We know the psychometric properties of all of those different items because they're well validated. They're in the item bank. There must be some work we can do to reduce the burden around validated new sets of items to enable that kind of conceptual coherence in the way that we want to present the data back to patients and physicians and regulators.
That sounds like a meaty project. But
well,
impactful.
It's just the sort of thing that Devin should be looking at because it's right up his street, I think, honestly. So I'm hoping for that anyway.
A challenge down, Devin.
I'll take it.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives on COA and eCOA specifically within oncology research. And thank you so much, Devin, Bill, Melissa, and Thomas for being part of this eCOA conversation.
Did you enjoy this episode? Share it with a friend or colleague, or leave a review on iTunes, and help others discover and support our mission. We are welcoming guests with a range of experiences and viewpoints. The views expressed belong to the guests themselves. Learn more about Critical Path Institute at cpath.org. That's c-path.org. Stay tuned for our next episode coming soon, and thanks for listening.